Welcome to Market Crash Money, April 14th, 2018. Just 12 hours after Trump authorized a missile strike in Syria. In today's video, we will be taking a closer look at how previous conflicts and wars of the United States affected the stock market in the United States. As you know, in our channel here, Market Crash 2018, we analyze what possibly is coming in order for you to be able to protect yourself and your family and your finances. Not only to protect, but also to be able to prosper instead of being a victim of circumstances that you cannot control. In this channel, we share videos specifically on some option strategies and how you can profit from the ever-changing market environment. So if this is your first time, subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for more videos to follow. Here's what we've got going on today. History of stock market reactions to war. To summarize, initially, if we look in the last 100 years, the market will experience a drop of roughly 7 to 11%. Now, that is a short-term impact. Typically, this would be followed by a prolonged sideways pattern. In other words, market would not be going significantly higher or significantly lower. It will be trading in a sideways pattern. Now, at the conclusion of war, we will typically see a 30 to 36% bull run after the war ends. Now, here's some examples, and please keep in mind, there's always exceptions to the rule. And the exception to the rule here is World War II. For example, World War II, after the war announcement, the market just kept falling and falling substantially over a longer period of time to where they have fallen roughly 34%. Now, from the low point, they were able to rebound substantially within 6 months. After the low point, 25%, and within 12 months, 54%. On average, the immediate response of the market, as you can see, if we take a look at the Korean War, Cuban Missile Crisis, and war in Iraq, and so on, we're looking 7 to 11% market correction shortly after the war commences. Now, some other things to consider. How long is the war? How long is the conflict? Okay, and in some shorter term conflicts, an example of that would be, the Grenada, Panama, first Gulf War, Kosovo, and so on. In other words, wars that were not 4 or 5 years long. They're shorter term. The only exception here, I guess, would be the war in Afghanistan, because that dragged out for years and years and years and years and years. So what do we have? Typically, it's also important to analyze the environment prior to the war announcement and look at that in a context. So where would this come helpful? Well, as you probably know, the markets has already come off of its high in 2018, about 10%. So if we analyze the short-term situations, most of them in the prior month, and this analysis is based off the Dow, okay, was down as much as 1%, and 2.6%. After that, after the initial drop following that, the markets within a month were able to rebound to the extent of 4%, 3 months to the extent of 7%, and 6 months to the extent of 7%. Now again, this is if we focus on shorter term conflicts. Okay, we'll get to the importance of that in just a second. So keep in mind, if in the prior month the Dow Jones Industrial Average have been falling, at the war announcement, it retracted lower, but within a very short relative period of time, it was able to rebound substantially in relation to the percentage of the drop. Okay, again, this pertains to the shorter term war in conflicts. And again, the key to consider here is the previous environment of the market. In this particular case, the market environment, again, has fallen substantially lower than that. So going into this war conflict announcement, okay, how would the markets respond Monday? Well, because the market has already fallen substantially to the extent of 10%, okay, looking back at the history, could it fall another 10%? Yes, there's a chance of that. But because of the fact that the market has dropped down substantially, the further fall could be temporarily diminished. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples. Let's take a look at some examples of the wars. Okay, now these wars are longer term. For example, right here we have the example of World War I. World War I, as you can see at the World War I commencement. Short spike down, followed by short spike higher, and then a significant spike lower, followed by an overall rise over long term. Okay, now what do we have here? We have a World War II. World War II, as you can see, initially the reaction was not drastic. The markets has fallen a little bit, and they went sideways for a little bit, and then we see this huge drop to the extent of over 30%, followed by a subsequent rise. Now again, this is much longer term impact on the market. So this is from 1939 through 1941-42. So this drop of over 36% actually is taking place over the course of 2.5 years, opposed to this drop taking place over the course of a year. All right, let's take a look at the Korean War. As you clearly see, initial drop almost immediately when the war begins, followed by a subsequent rise, very drastic rise to the extent of 30%. Now, this is probably one exception to the rule. So keep in mind when I mentioned earlier that there will be some exceptions, this is definitely one of the exceptions where a short-term fall followed by almost an immediate drastic rise that lasts for a long period of time. Now, the war in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam clearly is immediate fall followed by a short-term rise, following the subsequent fall, short-term rise, and a subsequent fall. Now, this graph actually has been predominant in the United States stock market over the last 30 days. So if what we have seen so far is the beginning of this graph, then any further war announcements and escalation of the conflict could very well be drawing the rest of the graph. Right now, actually, we are in this part of the graph if we're comparing to where the Dow maxed out at 26.5, and since February, it's been falling, you know, in a downward trend, going higher, falling again, and now trading around $24,000 range. So this could be actually the beginning of the pattern here. And in Vietnam War, the stock prices keep falling and falling in a downward trend for a number of years. So as you can see, different wars, different reactions, but one thing they all have in common is there is an initial drop which is followed by a rise later that is much greater than the percentage of the drop. So that is something important to keep in mind. And also, again, it is important to keep that in mind in relation to the duration of the war. Let's take a look at the overall history over the last 100 years. And I have circled first right here World War I, where clearly overall over the course of the 4 years, the markets are going sideways. So by circling that, I'm trying to illustrate that after the initial drop, the markets have been going sideways for a number of years. So this would be a typical characteristic after the initial drops. There's going to be ups and downs in between, but overall the trend is not going anywhere. The markets are trending sideways. Now, after the World War I ends, we see, of course, the roaring 20s, where the market skyrockets significantly over the course of 8-9 years. Now, World War I, again, we just looked at this period of 1939 through 1941, where initially, when the World War II commences, the markets drop down substantially to where they pick up, and later we see a substantial rise in the markets. During the Korean War, there's your fall, and there's, after the end of the war, a subsequent rise, a huge bull run that just lasts for a long amount of time. The Vietnam War, okay, here's your side trend right here, actually a clear downward trend for some time that really prevails the market. And in my view, this is what actually the period of time that we could be entering right now, and we're just at the initial stage of the drop. So, and ultimately, that fall could stop, and I'll talk in just a second where I think it could stop, but eventually it will be followed, obviously, by a bull run. But before we get there, I think we're going to be going for a number of years where there's going to be some definite pain in the stock market. So what are some of the things to consider in the market reaction this time? Well, the missile strikes yesterday in Syria could carry a longer-term war consequence. If we compare it to the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, that conflict did not last very long. So the market dropped 7% and then it went significantly higher subsequently over the following few months. Now, we may not be seeing this because if certain countries start taking action, this could be just United States initiating the war that could last for years. And again, the importance here is to look at the duration of the war in terms of the stock market reaction. What could be taking place this time that could be different? As you probably know, United States practices of being always right going out there in the world and breaking certain laws that are not permissible to do for other countries, but it is permissible for the United States. Times and times and times over, there's no evidence or proof that a certain country is doing something wrong. In the advance of the missile attacks that were launched yesterday, there were no evidence that there was any chemical weapons used or there were any people killed. However, United States simply makes an assumption that that is the truth and that is the case, and it go ahead and attacks a civilian capital with a huge number of civilians with missiles. And apparently it is okay to do so without any evidence or any verification. In the United States does not have to follow any rules or regulations. Now, you may agree or disagree with that. However, the bigger picture here is this, and please stay through the rest of this video because I will be playing a video from the words from the mouth of a teenager, taking us back in history and time, where it looks like some of the things that the United States are doing are 100% righteous. And this is what explained in the textbooks and all the news channels and media in the United States. However, exactly the opposite is taking place. So one of my purposes of putting some of these videos is to make sure that some of you that are a victim of the media are not simply watching this information and completely being brainwashed on whatever the media here in the United States is trying to portray to be true, because oftentimes the reality is quite different. In my view, here's the main concern. United States repetitively ignoring all types of international laws, whether it comes to international trade and tariffs, or whether it comes to making its own ruling without any sources of evidence in regards to destroying civilian cities in other countries, and yet placing judgment on other countries at the same time, is not only a 100% pure hypocrisy, but it devalues and destroys the foundation that the United States is built upon in the first place. This will not go unpunished forever. And this is why I am fearful for United States citizens, including my children. And it has been doing that throughout the history over the last 200 years. At some point, if you keep doing that without any proof or evidence, at some point, someone, a country out there will stand up and they will respond. And because so far nobody has really responded to United States actions throughout history, does not mean that it's not going to take place. And what typically takes the markets down is what is often referred to a black swan event. In other words, something that happens that the market do not calculate. For example, Donald Trump winning the election was probably one of the recent ones, the Brexit. So things like that happen throughout history again and again. And in this case, I think this is the beginning of what could end up being a World War III, and in which case we could see the market react similar to how it reacted in World War II, where it dropped to the extent of 30–40%. So in this case, this could result in the markets dropping over the course of the next 3–4 years to the extent of 25–50% compared to a typical 7–11% drop. Now, knowing this information, what do? How do you protect yourself? You have nothing to do with Trump launching the missiles on Syria. You have nothing to do with that, okay? So, but clearly it will have impact on you and your family and everyone here in the United States, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not. So the only thing you can do is look at history and make sure that you don't take these circumstances take advantage of you and your family. And how do you do that? Well, Some of the wealthiest people created wealth when the markets dropped. And if you're interested in learning how to do that, there's different instruments of being able to do that. For example, shorting stocks. Buying gold is sort of a typical strategy, but at times when markets drop, gold drops as well. How do you do that? Well, the most lucrative way to do it is through options, long-term options and short-term options, if for those of you that are interested in being a trader in the stock market. So whether you want to be a short-term trader or a long-term investor, option strategy, if you understand it, if it's well thought out and calculated, could produce unbelievable results. So if you're interested in learning more information about this, visit marketcrash.money. Click right here, how to profit, schedule a one-on-one consultation. Okay, it is not a webinar with a bunch of other people in there. It's going to be a one-on-one consultation where you'll be able to ask specific questions and where specific strategies, specific option strategies will be revealed to you that are very relevant to the current market environment. So if you are wanting to learn more, if you want to be a short-term or long-term investor, and you want to find out more about these options strategies, click this big green button and take action now. Don't let the current circumstances take advantage of you. Find out ways how you can not only protect yourself and the family, but how you can actually prosper in such an environment. Thanks for watching, and at this point, please take another few minutes and watch the video about the teenager sharing some important information that was relevant over 100 years ago, and I believe it is still relevant today for those of us that may still be in the dark, not clearly understanding what could actually be taking place. Just remember, things sometimes are not what they appear to be.
Hi, my name is Joshua Petrikat, your host. Welcome to Hidden History, where we will talk about events in our history that are usually not covered in our textbooks. Today I'm going to talk about the Philippine-American War. The Philippine-American War was a war between the U.S. and Filipino revolutionaries officially from 1899 to 1902. However, fighting really continued until 1913. After the Spanish-American War, the Treaty of Paris in 1898 was signed, which gave the U.S. control of the entire Philippines archipelago, Puerto Rico, and Guam, which were previously controlled by Spain. During the Spanish-American War, the Filipinos were told by the Americans that they would be granted independence after the war if they helped fight against the Spanish. They rebelled against Spain before, and they thought that their struggle for independence was similar to the American Revolution and the struggle for independence from Britain. So they believed that the Americans would understand and let them be a sovereign nation. The American Navy destroyed the Spanish Navy at Manila Bay in May 1898. In June, Emilio Aguinaldo, a Filipino leader, declared independence and set up a constitutional government. When the Spanish surrendered Manila, the Americans would not allow the Filipinos to enter the city, which caused tensions. In Manila, American soldiers entered people's homes without a warrant and stole goods from stores, which was parallel to the behavior of English soldiers in Boston in 1775. Since the Americans wanted to conquer the Philippines and they only had control of Manila while the rest was controlled by Filipino revolutionaries, conflict between the two parties was inevitable. The U.S. claimed that they were liberators in the Philippines, but they were really just trying to conquer it because of three main reasons. Number one, to have a military base in Asia where they could project American power. Number two, to have access to Asian markets where they could sell American products in places like China. Number three, to control natural resources of the Philippines such as rice, coffee, sugar, and tobacco. This is extremely ironic because America at that time was preaching about its democracy and self-determination, which means the right of all people to be independent and set up their own governments. The reality was that the U.S. wanted to be a world power and was practicing imperialism. This is part of the reason why we don't hear so much about this war. The other reason we don't hear much about this war is because of the way this war was conducted. In November 1901, a reporter for the Philadelphia Ledger who was in the Philippines wrote, "Our men have been relentless, have killed to exterminate men, women, children, prisoners and captives, active insurgents and suspected people from the lads of 10 up the idea prevailing that the Filipino as such was little better than a dog. Letters from American soldiers who were there also revealed what was going on. Leonard F. Adams of the Washington Regiment wrote, "I don't know how many men, women, and children the Tennessee boys did kill. They would not take any prisoners." Freddie Sweet of the Utah Light Battery wrote, "The scene reminded me of shooting jackrabbits in Utah. Only the jackrabbits sometimes got away, but the insurgents did not." Horrible racist terms were used by the Americans to describe the Filipino people. And President McKinley claimed that after praying to God, it came to him that the U.S. should take all of the Philippines to civilize them. Torture was also used, and sometimes innocent people were pulled out of villages and tortured to get information. Entire villages were destroyed and crops burned to starve people and to prevent them from helping Filipino soldiers. Concentration camps were set up for civilians, and many people were executed, and many more were starved to death and succumbed to disease. Aguinaldo was captured in 1901, and the war officially ended in July 1902. However, a guerrilla war known as the Moro Rebellion against American imperialists occurred until 1913. The Philippine-American War was a conflict between the American imperialists and the Filipino nationalists who only wanted freedom. In our very own history book that we use for 8th grade U.S. history, the book has 1,171 words covering the Spanish-American War, which lasted 3 months and in which 400 American soldiers died. However, in the same history book, there are 164 words covering the Philippine-American War, which officially lasted 3 years, and if you counted the years of sporadic fighting after that, it was 11 more years. 4,000 American soldiers died, 20,000 Filipino soldiers died, and 250,000 Filipino civilians died. History is important since it teaches us to learn from our mistakes. It can help us become a better country and better people. However, if we ignore some parts of our history, we will not learn from these mistakes. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, Joshua, for making such a great video. And hey, guys, give this young man some support and subscribe to his channel. Right here, go to Joshua Petricat on YouTube and check out some of his other great videos that he's made.